Welcome back to the Adventures in Historyland YouTube channel. Ladies and gentlemen, today we have a very special guest all the way from Canada, Pardeep Singh Nagra, who I happened to accidentally run into on a street very randomly and got to talking. I was very inspired by his story, and I hope you will be too. Everybody, welcome Pardeep to the show. Yay! So yes, welcome to the show, Pardeep.
My pleasure, Josh. Thanks for
How
hosting me.
my absolute pleasure. How's things in Canada?
Things are well, except for what's happening right now at the Olympics. If anyone's watching, we got a little bit of a bad rap because of the drone incidents.
Oh
But
dear.
hopefully we can redeem ourselves as a nation. If we
Yeah,
win today, then we're on, and hopefully those things will be past us a little bit. But otherwise, all is well here in Canada.
excellent. You must be following the Olympics fairly closely because you're an athlete yourself, aren't you?
Yeah, absolutely. I competed at the national levels here for Canada as a boxer. And it's interesting, some aspects of following it. Actually, I was battling at the national championships for the 1999 for the 2000 Sydney Olympics when I was disqualified because of my beard. And what's interesting is I just watched a Canadian boxer yesterday compete at the Olympics with a beard and his opponent having a beard. In fact, almost every single boxer right now are donning beards in the Olympics.
Uh-huh.
And yet, I went through this huge legal battle. My life was threatened. It turned into a Hollywood movie. And then
Yeah.
you look at it 20 years later and you say, what was it all for? What was it all about? And so it's shocking, disappointing, frustrating. Um, but yeah, that's the way sometimes things go. And thinking about, we're talking about sports and look at the host country, which are not allowing their female athletes to wear hijabs. I mean,
Hmm.
it's abortion. It's human rights violations at the 10th degree. And yet, ironically, they can in competition, but they couldn't as they represented the country in opening ceremonies and everything else, or on home soil in other ways. And yet, when this is a history channel that we're talking
Yeah.
about, right?
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
and one of the very first Sikh fighter pilots, Hardeep Singh Malik in World War I, wore a turban, and
Yeah.
I have images right behind me,
See him.
in the hundreds of us arriving in France, because we were called once the World War broke out and started in 1914 in August by September. And we arrived into France in September of 1914 and with our turbans,
Hmm.
carrying the French flag saying, we're here to protect your country and your land and your flag. And yet, that time, nobody asked why we have turbans on. Nobody asked us to remove our turbans. And so we fought for the rights and values and land of France with our turbans on, and yet that same country today is denying us that right. So in fact, I wouldn't be able to speak to you because I'm also a civil servant here
Hmm.
in on a provincial level. And in France, no member of public service in any capacity, whether it's at the municipal levels or other areas, can wear a turban. And so as a teacher, I work for a school board, wouldn't be able to work in France. Here, that would extend out to things like municipality. If you're a bus driver for the municipality or what have you and stuff, or holding any public service position. And so it's a real sad state of affairs, as much as we're celebrating,
Hmm.
to know that these kind of violations go on and couched in misrepresenting and misinformation around this concept of secularism,
Hmm.
because the concept of separation of church and state just means one thing: that the state will not become a religion.
Hmm.
It didn't say that the president of a nation or the prime minister of a nation or a head of state cannot be a person of faith. In fact,
Yeah.
they are.
Yeah.
Right,
It's almost a
right.
requirement in some
Right.
places.
Yeah, right. And then applying this concept and thinking that society and laws and everything are neutral, and they're not,
Hmm.
because you have to look at the application, how they impact individuals. And so not having a critical lens and look through these pieces, is part of the challenge. And I think it also speaks to when we're talking, what we're going to possibly get into in some of these discussions, is this concept of um, narrative scarcity.
Mm.
I think people will be floored to know the contributions of people who look like me wearing a turban. And in fact, many historians have said, we saved France,
Yeah.
right? Bar none. And you look at some great battles in Ypres and on the Somme. Ferdinand Foch, the commander in chief of the Allied forces, had said after the battle in the Chapelle, he said, "Go back to your sun-bathed land and tell all your countrymen how their blood soaked the fields of Flanders."
Hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
And yet, just think about that from a concept of history, and now look at what history is telling us in 2024 in France, for example, just
Yeah.
as one narrative,
No,
right?
absolutely.
Yeah.
It's a great injustice. It doesn't make any sense because, as you say, um, during the height of the British Empire, a very dodgy time for, Britain and equality and, sovereignty and things like that.
Yeah.
Indian troops fought across the world wearing turbans.
Yes. Yeah.
And nobody thought twice about it. In fact, it would have been very strange to an audience to see Sikh troops or Indian troops not wearing a turban.
Oh, no, absolutely. And think about this, Josh, as well. So we ended up meeting on the streets
Yeah,
right across in front of the museum,
yeah,
the Wallace Museum there, and the great exhibition on Ranjit Singh is happening. And when we're again talking about this history, one of the most fascinating artifacts that I've really enjoyed the most. Um, well, in fact, there's a lot now that I'm thinking about in this lens that
yeah.
I'm going through. But was the letter from the King of France to the Sikh King,
Mm,
Maharaja Ranjit Singh. And, when we were talking about during the reign of the Sikh Kingdom, prior to the annexation by the British Empire, the French and the Sikhs were allies. Many of the generals in the Sikh army, like General Allard, who was also featured there. You look at one of the phenomenal paintings that's borrowed from the Louvre there of Ranjit Singh on horseback, and it has has the
yeah. It,
tricolor there of France flag in the background there, right? And
mhm.
so many different intersectionalities when you actually look at it that way as well. And that's why information blogs, conversations such we're having around history are critically important because it provides a more what I call inclusive and accurate representation of history,
Mhm.
and not a Eurocentric biased lens of what history is. And that really, in principle, I've always said, with lack of agency and social capital, it's really saddening the impact it has, not on the people that should have that agency and social capital, but for all individuals who have been robbed of a more accurate history, for them to have a more informed approach
Mhm.
of society, of people, of civilizations, of communities, of peoples. And it would give a different perspective. And I think we would be closer as people and nations if we had that understanding of the history.
Yeah, I think so too. And I think it's one of the great strengths and positive uses of history that we can try and sort of just make the conversation healthier. You can use history as a positive, something positive. It doesn't always have to be negative.
Yeah.
And so on that subject, let's talk a little about this heritage here.
Yeah.
Now you have an organization that you head up, which I think is the Sikh Heritage
Yeah, the Sikh
Association.
Heritage Museum of Canada. I'm actually
Yep,
sitting right in our boardroom right now.
there you go.
Right. And and the purpose of this was I would almost say fivefold in one sense. Number one, many of us on the board and myself as executive director are collectors. And why is collecting important for us? Because we feel that our artifacts, our history, our narratives should be in our hands, right? We shouldn't be dependent on museum holdings to have either access to or story tell through, or how we can tell their story, right? And so number one is about collecting artifacts and having them within our control so that we can share and engage them as necessary. And I think, again, coming back to the exhibition on Ranjit Singh at the Wallace Museum, world's leading Sikh collector, Devinder Tour, is doing just that, right? And then using that as a tool to embrace other collections to come in as part of our storytelling. And we're not solely dependent on others to even have
Mm,
access or not have access to our own artifacts, our own history. That's number one. Number two, it's about creating resources that are bigger than the objects in of themselves. So again, we were at that exhibition, and there's a catalog that was produced on the exhibition. So that gives people a chance to immerse themselves in something deeper and further than just seeing those objects in themselves in that one experience. And so these resources are critically important. Number three, it's about storytelling, because either our story is never going to be told or it's going to be told through someone else's lens, right? And so that's an important factor for us here at the museum. Number four, it's about having a place where you can come in contact with real live objects of our history, right? Because it's one thing to say, hey, do you want to see the Mona Lisa? And you can see it on a TikTok video, maybe you can see it in a magazine or over your phone. But it's another one to see something in person. And so we have objects, we have maps from 1780, we have a number of different artifacts here. And so people can come in almost in a first person visceral contact with their history, their lineage, and it has a huge impact. And then number five, it's about creating what I call community ambassadors, community historians. Because once you kind of immerse yourself or come in through an experience like this, one or two things can happen. You can either just leave and never speak about it again, and the history and knowledge just stops there, or you can use that and manifest that and spread that. And so it's through those kind of spirits. And so when people actually ask, coming to the Sikh Heritage Museum of Canada, what they're going to see, I usually tell them the first thing you're going to see is Canadian history through a Sikh lens, right? Because quite often the history that we've been taught or that's been shared, like I mentioned, is a Eurocentric lens. And so, we have a timeline of us in Canada. And it's in fact, as when the current Prime Minister of Canada had visited the museum, he said, thank you for all the hard work that went into showcasing the history and story of the Sikhs, which is just in fact the story of Canada,
mhm.
right? And that's what it means for us here at the museum.
Amazing. Yeah, that's wonderful that you've put this together. And I think it is very important that, um, you know, people take ownership of their own stories. No one can tell your story better than you can. It's
Yeah,
helpful.
absolutely.
It's nice to have the interest from the outside world,
Yeah.
yeah, yay, but I can tell this better than you can. And there's no harm in that. There's no insult in that. Why shouldn't you tell
and
your own
and and the
stories?
autonomy
Yeah.
and the autonomy, right, to share your story through your lens, right? Because you can look at many different movements, whether it's civil rights movements and how civil rights leaders might get portrayed. You look at Nelson Mandela, and we actually have him featured on our wall because when he was freed, his first visit was to Canada, because Canada was a country that supported him in his release quite heavily. And he met with members of the Sikh community. And in fact, at his house, which is now a museum, there's a plaque from the Sikh community of Canada there. And we feature that story here on our timeline piece itself. But you look at someone like himself, for some, he was labeled as a terrorist.
Yes.
And for others, he was a freedom fighter, right? So who's ever going to be telling the story is going to be using different terms to describe the same person and same actions, right? And
Yep.
so that's just one example, and we have those kind of examples here as well, right? We were seen as mischievous for foiling a plot to remove all of us out of Canada that time, who was going to become the future Prime Minister of Canada, William Lyon Mackenzie King, had a plan to get rid of all of us out of Canada and send us to the closest British territory, which at that time was known as Belize, right?
Yeah.
British Honduras, right?
Okay.
And we foiled that plot. And in a letter that we have here at the museum speaking to that, they call us the mischievous ones, the mischievous agitators for poisoning the minds of Sikh immigrants against Honduras, okay? British Honduras. But when we're storytelling that narrative, we're saying Mackenzie King was the mischievous one for coming up with the plan.
Hmm. I mean,
right?
as tempting as it must be to like make a t-shirt with like the mischievous ones on it or something, like just own it.
Yeah.
I see what you're talking about. Yeah, definitely. And it's so
Yeah, yeah,
true.
yeah.
It's
Well,
absolutely
well,
true.
and we did that. Ali Kazemi wrote a book on the Komagata incident from 1914, and yeah, he did title it "Undesirables." Komagata, White Canada, and the Komagata,
Mm,
right? Because we're referred to as undesirables, right?
right.
So,
Hmm.
so you look at those juxtapositions, right, around narratives, right, and
Yeah.
how we're spoken about or to,
Yeah.
right? And that's why that storytelling is really, really fundamentally important.
Absolutely. So, let's talk a little about the Sikhs in Canada then,
Yeah,
and how important a role they have played in it, in the country, in the nation, and indeed in the as soldiers and statesmen as well. Um,
yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah,
uh,
we've touched every single social fabric of society, as you mentioned, right? And it's interesting when we go back, and just because when you're looking at the British Empire and colonialism and stuff like that, it's intertwined, even our Canadian story, because the gentleman who signed the Treaty of Lahore with Ranjit Singh in 1808 was Charles Metcalfe, and he was part of the British East India Company. And he signed the Treaty of Lahore, and then he got further up into the administration, and he actually married a Sikh lady from Lahore court. But I don't think he traveled out of India with his partner, because you can imagine those days.
hmm.
If you just like a civil rights movement in the 1960s, imagine early 1800s and having a
Very
racialized
few,
partner.
very few
Yeah,
people
very
did it.
few.
Some of the
But
French
but he
generals
became
did it, but
right, but he became governor of Jamaica, and then came to Canada and became the governor. So before the concept of prime minister, the concept of
yeah.
governor of Canada, East and West, was literally the prime minister of Canada. And so here's Charles Metcalfe, a British administrator there, and there's streets in Ottawa named after Metcalfe right in front of our Parliament buildings. There's a town, Metcalfe, Ontario. So that's where our history starts with Canada and Sikhs, with Charles Metcalfe. Then you also look at Sir Robert Peel, for which the museum's located in Mississauga, but in the region of Peel, and it's named after Sir Robert Peel. The Peelers and the Bobby's Boys and stuff. But he was the British Prime Minister who started the war to annex the Sikh Kingdom, right? So we speak about that kind of history itself as part of the narratives as well. And then we speak about 1867, when so-called Canada was founded. And I always laugh around this finding of Canada, because I said, when was Canada lost? It was never lost as a landmass,
Depends if you ask
right?
the French.
But right, you ask, it depends who you ask, right? And so yeah, in 1867, Sir who was going to then become our first prime minister, Johnny MacDonald, was in England. He had just signed the B&A Act, and he's writing to a friend. And he says, I'm sure war is going to come one day between the U.S. and England. And he's writing to a friend back in British India, and he says, you can do us a yeoman's of service by sending us over an army of Sikhs and Gurkhas and stuff. And you say, 1867, no Twitter, no Facebook. Where is this narrative coming from, right? Why is he asking for an army of Sikhs, right? As collateral, right, to surrounding California and stuff. But when you look at those kind of concepts, right, to look at what history and how it shapes itself, and the narratives with the Sikh community, and then you look at Maharaja Ranjit Singh's son, or a grandson, so
Mhm.
Dalip Singh's son, was the first person of Sikh lineage and heritage to come. He was part of, is it the big military school? Is it Eton?
Sandhurst?
Sandhurst. Yeah,
Yeah.
he was at Sandhurst, and and um, and he came as a captive aide, and he lived in Halifax here for 2 years in 1888. And then as part of Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee celebrations and stuff, 1897 celebrations, there was members of that contingency that came across through Canada as part of the celebrations. And then as a community, as a settler community, with the early 1900s, because we were serving as part of the British, um, not only army, but localized police forces in the British colonies, for example, in Hong Kong and in Singapore and a number of other places. And through those kind of contacts and exploration and exodus, the community started to get settled here in Canada. And so that shows some of the early settlement pieces. A lot of discrimination obviously going on around the turban, owning land, even the right to citizenship. We were disenfranchised in 1907. And it took 40 years for the right to franchise. There were other laws and restrictions. Women and families couldn't join the men. We had to have a higher, not similar to the Chinese head tax. We had to pay $200 for entry versus $25 for Europeans, right? And so those kind of things still manifested themselves. But there are Sikhs that still managed to squeak through, and I say this squeak through because even Joe, though the war started, World War One, Black, Indigenous, Sikh, or other racialized groups were not welcome necessarily into the military. And yet there was a handful of Sikhs that joined, although we're disenfranchised, still to serve. And they were going to go and meet many other from the British Commonwealth, Sikh and Punjabi and Indian soldiers there in the war efforts. And you look through some of those kind of pieces, and then you look at where the community has come of age and around nation building and legacy. And like I said, from having an opposition leader who is of the Sikh faith, to having politicians and ministers, and mayors, and so this political spectrum we covered for sure. And then you're looking at industry. Right, and you're looking at corporate industry, you're looking at other aspects of sports and entertainment, and just all fabrics of society. We continue to and have contributed well to this nation, and a lot of great stories to share about Sikhs in Canada and Sikh Canadians.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I hope hope we're doing that, a little bit of that here. And obviously, anybody who wants to learn more, there will be links for you to go and explore through Pardeep's website and anything else I can think of. I'll even put the exhibition in London in the description box as well, because that runs until I think October or something like that. It's
Yeah,
really
October
good.
20th, right? So
Yeah,
yeah, you could put my own personal website, you could put the museum website, a few other resources, absolutely, sure.
definitely. So let's see if we can kind of, I don't know. I don't see where the clock is at the second, but we're doing some pretty good time here.
Yeah.
What to you? So how do you think that heritage, history, stories, and the defense and protection of your own culture with the wearing of beards and turbans, whatever you choose to do, how do you think history and heritage helps people today navigate these problems you've been speaking about?
I think history is important because sometimes people don't realize, for example, when people, want to use terms like immigrant, and they're going, no, my community is part of a stock that's been here over 150 years in Canada. And we don't use it because of reconciliation, the term pioneers, because it's hard for someone to call themselves a pioneer community when we have the Indigenous peoples of Canada as original pioneers. But nevertheless, that term still exists. It still has some social capital and agency attached to it. But when you look at those lenses, you ask yourself a few questions, because I ask this from educators in my field. And if you want to know what history or the lack of history can produce when there's lack of agency and social capital, it's just this narrative. I'll ask educators, have you ever used the word pioneer to describe people who look like me in Canada? And if they haven't, then we would never walk any space in Canada as a people and as a community and have that agency and social capital with that term attached to people who look like me. Yet again, you can flash a whole bunch of pictures if you just type into Google Sikh Pioneers Canada, and you'll see wonderful pictures of us as a pioneer community here working in the lumber mills and the railroads and all those aspects and stories that we've learned, so to speak, in history of other people working on the railroads and the lumber mills, but not people who actually look like me, who actually also did work on those pieces, right? And so having that narrative is critically important. Similarly, if I said, have you ever used the term brave to describe people who look like me? And how about adding another moniker of brave soldier, right? Because we have been and we continue to be in terms of, and our military history is literally, I would say, second to none, right? And so then it begs that question, if they don't have that in their mind, then what history were they taught, or whose history were they taught,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so that's why history can play an important role. Because when I tell people, and I show them pictures of us as soldiers, I go, "Where is this?" I go, "In France, World War One." They go, "You guys served?" I served, right? We served in the 100,000s, right? And that's why history is important. I think we started off even the beginning of this podcast around why history is important. For example, even where the Olympics are being hosted right now as we speak during the Olympic moments, right? So history has an important part that way. It also has an important part for individuals themselves who are part of that community to give them a sense of identity and history. Like it's surprising when we have what I call newcomers to Canada, and I share with them. I said, you have just as much of a long, deep history here in Canada as well that you need to be proud of over 100 years. Go, wow, do we? And it gives them a great sense of pride and a sense of identity and a sense of belonging,
Mm.
right? And so those aspects are important as well for individuals as part of the community themselves to have that joy and understanding. And I see that regularly. I see it on both fronts.
Yeah.
I see people get emotional when they come to the museum. People from within the community who are just in tears because they say, "Wow, and this is powerful, didn't know all this stuff." And people outside of my community going, "Wow, I thought I was a history buff, or I thought I was a historian, or I thought I knew," and they're going, "I knew nothing," and they're in
Mm.
tears.
Mm.
Because they're having a disruptive, reconcilable moment of who and what they thought they were or knew versus a new, equally powerful narrative that can stand on its own.
Yeah. No, yes, absolutely. I think this is very true. And I've talked to people before as well who have gone to museums and things like that, and it's really opened their minds, and they come out of it with the classic quote, "Why wasn't I taught this before? Why didn't I know
Yes.
this before?"
Why didn't I
You
learn this? Why
know,
didn't I learn
who's
this?
been
Yeah.
hiding this? Well, it's always
Yes.
been
Yeah.
there. It's just
Yeah. Yeah,
um
and that's the issue because quite often sometimes people say, "Oh my God, you go to a museum and I didn't know," and I said, "You didn't know? Have you been searching for it? We exist." And so when we're talking about social media and algorithms, what are you searching for? Because we're there, and if you're interested, and I'm just saying, let's just say you could say Sikh military history, Sikh history, Sikh Canadian history, Sikh British history. It's at your fingertips.
mhm.
And that can become your algorithms and you can learn as much as you want and go as deep as you want, right? So that's the interesting piece too, equally that there's a dual responsibility because there's the why, but then there's also now what are you prepared to do if you should know better and do better, right?
Mhm.
To know that I was taught a history of the war. It would be fascinating to know whose stories have not been told, who's missing as part of these narratives, and let me go and engage and search and see,
Yeah.
right? And so it's a dual responsibility.
Let me see. What do you have any kind of pla like events coming up at the museum? Are you involved in anything that you want to share with the audience about how, or anything they can get involved with that you would advise they do?
Sure, for the same reason I talked about different aspects of the museum, it's really becoming a community historians, community ambassadors, and I'd really encourage people engaging in this program to go and explore more. If there's any little aspect of our conversation that's intrigued you, fascinated you, surprised you, it's a great opportunity to go and explore and learn more, even if it's aspects related to, for example, for me talking about the Indigenous peoples of Canada and reconciliation in the TRC, to know who are the Indigenous peoples of your land or your community or your nation is critically important as well. And then we can use different types of language as well, talking about being settlers here in Canada versus trying to take kind of ownership of some place. And so equally for us, that's always been the goal for us to encourage people to learn their history, learn other people's history, and explore because history can share a lot, teach us a lot, the good, the bad, and the ugly, which is all important because it forms who we are, right? And it helps us create a better community going forward. And so, if anything, when I'm always talking about, because we always have things going on at the museum. Um, we're seen as a resource in the community, provincially in Ontario, locally around Peel and Toronto, and then across Canada and even internationally. So there's always things happening. We're involved in a stamp release in 2025 that's going to come out. And so there's always lots of different things going on and projects going on. But really, all those are for one reason only, to share the history of Sikhs, both in Canada and the diaspora. And if people can explore more after this conversation, then I think we accomplished a lot through our conversation.
I think we did, and I hope that as well people take away from it the idea of, you know, learning about history and these stories, and like you say, pursuing like thoughts and interests as a way of keep bringing people together, rather than using history as a way to keep people apart, because that's
Yeah.
a big problem, and I think we can use
Mhm.
history more
Yeah, the
positively.
polarization, the divisiveness is not necessary.
So, thank you so much for coming on today,
My
Pardeep.
pleasure.
And I hope to talk to you again about something else, maybe more
Sure.
focused next time.
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
And so, if anybody wants to follow along with the Sikh Museum of Canada, then do please follow the links in the description box below. If you want to learn more about Pardeep, well, then there's a movie you can watch. For heaven's sake, this is a famous man. He's a legend. I mean, we should really just do an episode just about your life and your experience, because it's a very important.
We can,
It's a
because
very important.
I love talking about all the other knickknacks. I like my charitable work, humanitarian work,
Yeah.
my classic cars and boxing and marathon running and lots of things. So yeah, maybe.
Yeah, maybe we'll try and sort it out. If
Okay.
you desperately want to see Pardeep again, you want to learn about his story personally, then leave a comment in the description box. Leave it in the comments below, and we'll sort something out for you. But for now, thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe on the way out the door, and I hope you have a great rest of your day, morning, good night, wherever you are in the world. All right, take care, everybody. Thank you for watching.
Take
Talk
care.
to you.
Bye-bye.